December 18th, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow drifted down over the shattered trees of the Bulge. The air was sharp, bitter, filled with the hum of engines overhead. The sound of German dive bombers cutting through the winter haze. American GIs in foxholes looked up helplessly, their machine guns flashing uselessly against the sky. The Luftwaffe was on the prowl again, strafing columns of trucks and men winding through the forest roads below. But today, something was different. At an American gun battery near Bastogne, a young artillery lieutenant named Robert Bob Kephart crouched beside a 90mm anti-aircraft gun. He yelled over the deafening wind, "Load and fire! Use the new rounds!" His crew obeyed, slamming a shell into the chamber, one unlike any they had fired before. The gun recoiled. A thunderclap rolled across the forest. A second later, far above the treetops, the shell exploded. Not on contact, not by time fuse, but in midair, right beside a Messerschmitt Me-109 slicing through the clouds. The blast shredded its right wing in a shower of aluminum and smoke. The pilot bailed out too late. The wreck tumbled into the snow below. The gun crew froze for a heartbeat, disbelief, then wild cheers. For years, anti-aircraft fire had been a lottery, thousands of shells fired for a single kill. But this shell had somehow known when to explode. It was as if the weapon itself had developed a sixth sense. The proximity fuse had arrived on the battlefield. To understand how this little tech changed the war, we have to rewind, back to a time when the sky itself seemed unbeatable, when engineers and scientists were locked in secret rooms, building something the world had never seen, a shell that could think. It started in the early years of the war, before radar was common on the battlefield, before guided missiles were even a dream. The Allies were losing bombers and ships to fast-moving, high-flying aircraft they couldn't touch. Traditional anti-aircraft shells either exploded too early or too late. The enemy had time to swoop, strike, and vanish. In 1940, the British Air Ministry and American scientists both faced the same question. How do you make a shell detonate close enough to kill without needing a direct hit? The answer seemed impossible. A shell left the barrel at over 2,000 feet per second, spinning violently, enduring pressures that would crush a wristwatch into powder. And yet somehow, inside that spinning steel bullet, engineers were asked to build, of all things, a radio. That was the heart of the proximity fuse. Inside its steel casing, the fuse contained a tiny transmitter and receiver. As the shell screamed through the air, it emitted radio waves. When those waves bounced off a nearby object, say an airplane's metal skin, the returning signal interfered with the transmitter's output. That interference was detected and instantly triggered detonation. The result, a blast that didn't need to hit. It just had to get close. But making that work was like trying to fit a radar station into a bullet. The electronics of the 1940s were massive. Glass vacuum tubes, fragile wires, heavy capacitors. None of it could survive the G-forces of firing. That's when the U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, stepped in. Among its top secret divisions was a team led by Dr. Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in Maryland. Their mission: take radar principles and make them small, tough, and deadly reliable. Tuve's team started experimenting with miniature tubes, tiny vacuum tubes about the size of a thimble. Each one had to survive being shot out of a cannon and still function perfectly milliseconds later. Thousands shattered, circuits fried, shells detonated early. But failure was the fuel of their progress. In one of the APL's underground test chambers, engineer Charlie Henderson recorded in his notebook, "Shock resistance test 27. Failure again. Filament fracture at 14,000 Tartars Gs." The team didn't stop. They reinforced the tube filaments, improved the vacuum seals, and finally developed what they called the VR tube, a vacuum tube so rugged it could be fired from a gun and live to tell the tale. Now, with electronics that could survive the launch, they faced the next challenge: power. A battery that sat too long in storage or experienced high acceleration would fail. So they created the reserve battery, an ingenious design where the electrolyte was stored separately until firing. The instant the shell was fired, the shock would shatter an internal ampule, releasing the liquid to activate the battery, bringing the fuse to life only after it left the barrel. Every component had to work perfectly, or soldiers would die from premature explosions. And there was another problem: secrecy. The Allies couldn't risk the Axis discovering the design. If Germany or Japan recovered a single unexploded shell, they could reverse engineer it and develop countermeasures. The proximity fuse became one of the most classified technologies of the war, guarded as tightly as the Manhattan Project itself. Early on, the U.S. Navy became the first branch to adopt it. Testing began in 1942 off the coast of the United States, where 5-inch naval guns fired at drone targets. The results stunned everyone. Instead of thousands of shells per kill, it now took fewer than 100. The system was 20 times more effective. When Admiral William Blandy of the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance saw the results, he said only one thing: "Get this into production yesterday." Factories roared to life. Over 20 million proximity fuse would be built before war's end, assembled in secret plants by thousands of workers, most of them women, who were told only that they were helping build radio parts for the war effort. Few knew they were creating one of the most important fuses in military history. By 1943, the first combat test came in the Pacific, near the Solomon Islands. U.S. Navy ships, harassed by Japanese bombers, loaded the new shells and opened fire. What happened next stunned the crews. Enemy planes began exploding midair. Within minutes, the entire formation of Japanese dive bombers was shredded, their attack aborted. Admiral William Halsey's fleet survived what could have been a massacre. From that day forward, sailors began whispering a new nickname for the weapon: the fuse that thinks. June 5, 1944. The English Channel, off the coast of Plymouth. The night was a smear of black water and low clouds. On the bridge of the destroyer, USS Hummin, Lieutenant Commander Elliot Vance stamped his boots on the wet deck and peered through the binoculars. Ahead, lines of ships, transports, LSTs, cruisers, waited in tight, nervous formation. Men whispered into the dark, checking straps, tightening helmet chin straps, and trying to feel anything like sleep through the stink of oil and the throb of engines. Vance could taste the salt and diesel. The radio crackled reports of weather. Every surface looked like a silhouette against a blacker sea. Somewhere above, the sky pulsed with radar pings and searchlight sweeps. And the new small things rattling in the Hammond's magazine. Proximity-fused 5-inch shells, packed in canvas, stamped with codes and a strict label. Top secret. Handle with care. The war in Europe demanded something the Pacific had already taught the Navy. Aircraft didn't just come at you over open ocean. They dived, they skimmed, they hid in cloud banks, and flak had to be smarter. The Army's anti-aircraft units, the 90mm guns, 40mm Bofors, and vast barrages around London and industrial cities, had watched the naval results hungeringly. If a little radio inside a shell could turn scattershot into precision, then thousands of Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen might live. But shipping the fuse to Europe was not a logistical task. It was a war of nerves. The British and American governments insisted on unparalleled secrecy. Convoys carried the fuses in plain crates labeled as radio parts or optical equipment. Officers who opened them were sworn to silence. Even clocks in ordnance depots were compartmentalized. If a single unexploded proximity fuse fell into enemy hands, the Axis would race to copy or counter it. In quiet corridors of power, ministers and generals agreed. The fuse's existence must remain classified until victory was certain. On D-Day itself, as the first waves of landing craft hit Normandy's beaches, anti-aircraft crews worked through a different kind of fear. In a temporary battery near Utah Beach, Master Sergeant Earl Delaney bared his gloved hands to a crate and slid out a fresh 90mm shell. Its fuse cap gleamed under the rain. "Load the new rounds in the left racks," he muttered, voice low. "Keep the old ones for the rear guns." The crew moved like a single organism. A shell into the breach closed, elevation dialed, azimuth checked, and a spotter shouted the coordinates of a low-flying FW-190. The first time Delaney's crew fired a proximity-fused 90mm round at Normandy, the sky itself seemed to answer. The shell climbed on a parabolic arc, a metallic bird sped toward it, and then, boom! A bloom of smoke and feathers where the German plane had been a heartbeat before. Men on the beach cheered, and Delaney found tears and laughter in the same breath. Word of the new rounds, whispered and terrified and full of hope, moved down the lines. The fuse changed defensive doctrine. Where commanders had once ordered curtains of timed and contact fuse, planning massive barrages that consumed men, metal, and hours of firing, they began to hold fire, to let the proximity rounds fly as directed bursts. A single, well-aimed battery could now create lethal bubbles in the sky, three-dimensional minefields that turned approach corridors into death traps. Bomber formations that had once shrugged at anti-aircraft fire now scattered, lost cohesion, and suffered grievous losses. But it wasn't only aircraft that felt the fuse's bite. In the autumn of 1944, as the Germans launched the V-1 buzz bomb attacks against London and Antwerp, crews discovered another deadly application. The V-1s were small, fast, and flimsy. Too fast for many fighters, and too small for timed artillery that required precise fusing. Proximity fuses proved unexpectedly effective. A near miss could shred the V-1's control surfaces, tumble its pulse jet engine, or send it spinning into the Thames. Anti-aircraft units reoriented to knock these flying bombs out of the sky, with rounds that detonated in the V-1's vicinity, scattering shrapnel that tore into fabric and thin alloy. The fuse, born for big aircraft, now saved cities from small, buzzing death. Not every test was a triumph. Early crews reported horror stories, premature detonations that shredded barrels or sent fragments into nearby men. The engineers had warned that production variation and faulty handling could spell disaster. Strict procedures were written and enforced. Storage at controlled temperatures, no hammering of crates, no field tampering. Units received terse, official training manuals and a single, bitter warning, never to fire experimental rounds without the prescribed safety checks. Amid the triumphs and terrors ran the human cost of secrecy. Soldiers who loaded the fuses were often kept in the dark about the full science behind them. Sailors called them mystery rounds and joked about magic caps. In a field hospital near Caen, a medic named Anna Foley, a civilian contractor working on ordnance assembly back in the States, later wrote in a letter, once censored but preserved, that she sometimes wept at night, not knowing whether the tiny components she soldered would help a loved one survive or bring more efficient death to an enemy. She described the feeling as building fate one wire at a time. Beyond the front line, the weapon reshaped strategic planning. Fighter escorts no longer needed to close with bomber formations as much. Anti-aircraft defenses could thin the incoming threat. Naval task forces gained confidence to operate nearer contested shores. Commanders altered risk calculations. A harbor, once too dangerous for resupply, could now be held with fewer ships when proximity-fused rounds protected them from air attack. In mid-December 1944, as the Ardennes offensive unfolded and American batteries faced desperate skies, the Fuze once again proved decisive. Batteries that had been depleted of conventional ammunition now relied on proximity rounds to blunt low-level Luftwaffe attacks and to interdict transport columns. Stories circulated of entire enemy squadrons breaking off their runs as flak suddenly became surgical. Some gunners swore the sky fought back. Still, the Axis attempted countermeasures. Intelligence reports later showed German scientists experimenting with radar-absorbent paint and metal screens to mask aircraft signatures. In the field, aircrews adapted tactics, flying lower where terrain could mask returns, or approaching from angles that increased radar clutter. Yet each adaptation was met with another Allied improvement: adjustments in radio frequency, better signal discrimination, and tactics that paired fighters with layered flak belts. By the time the Allies pushed across the Rhine, the proximity fuse had become a quiet, lethal constant. Its presence did not end the war alone, but it multiplied the effectiveness of guns, reduced wasted ammunition, saved ships and cities, and, in 1,000 small ways, shortened the timetable of destruction. It was not a blockbuster weapon, no single dramatic blast that could be pointed to on a map, but a pervasive force multiplier that, like so much wartime technology, worked quietly, invisibly, and with devastating efficiency. As the guns fell silent and armies regrouped for occupation, men and women who had handled the fuse on assembly lines, in ship magazines, and in foxholes never expected the secret to be widely discussed. Their work had been a matter of life and death, condensed into a tiny radio inside a spinning shell. A technology that turned vulnerability into control and imbued a piece of metal with the power to judge distance and strike accordingly. March 1942, Johns Hopkins University, Maryland. In a dimly lit basement beneath the Homewood campus, the sound of a hammer echoed against steel benches. Sparks leapt from a soldering iron, catching the faces of exhausted men hunched over delicate circuits. A smell of hot metal and ozone hung in the air. On the wall, a sign read, "Applied Physics Laboratory, authorized personnel only." At the center of the chaos stood Dr. Merle Tuve, a tall physicist with tired eyes and a mind that never rested. His team wasn't made up of military men, but of young scientists, technicians, and machinists. Many of them fresh out of college, working 16-hour days under armed guard. Tuve looked over a test shell on the bench, its nose cone removed to reveal a delicate maze of wires and glass. "We're trying to fit a radar set," he muttered, "into something the size of a flashlight that has to survive 20,000 Gs. He glanced at his assistant, Dr. Leland Haworth, who just shook his head. The challenge was staggering. When a shell left the gun, the acceleration could exceed 20,000 times the force of gravity. At that pressure, glass shattered, filaments snapped, and solar joints tore apart. The first dozens of prototypes failed instantly. To make the fuse work, the team needed to reinvent nearly everything about electronics. They started with the vacuum tube, the heart of every 1940s circuit and the most fragile component imaginable. Ordinary tubes cracked like eggs, so the engineers developed what they called the acorn tube, a miniaturized, ultra-strong vacuum tube with reinforced filaments and shock-mounted supports. These tiny marvels were barely the size of a thumb, but could withstand the unimaginable stress of firing. Next came the battery problem. Ordinary batteries would either drain or rupture under acceleration. The solution was revolutionary, a reserve battery. The electrolyte, the fluid that activated the battery, was stored in a sealed glass ampule. When the gun fired, the shock shattered the ampule, releasing the liquid and powering the circuit at the perfect moment. That simple mechanism turned a dormant shell into a living sensor the instant it left the barrel. Even then, reliability hovered near zero. The first test firings were disasters. Shells that exploded too early, too late, or not at all. But Tuve refused to quit. He was part physicist, part field general, and his mantra became, "If it doesn't fail, it's not being tested hard enough." By summer 1942, the APL had grown into a small industrial complex. Dozens of test guns fired into the Chesapeake Bay every day. Engineers with clipboards ducked behind concrete barriers as artillery thundered overhead. Every recovered fragment was catalogued, studied, and fed back into the next design. At night, Tuve would drive home, his headlights off, mind still racing. He often told his wife, "We're not building a weapon, we're building time. Time our soldiers can live in." The work was so secret that even the military branches receiving the prototypes weren't told how they worked. When the Navy received the first functional batch of VT, variable time, fuses for 5-inch naval guns, officers were given sealed envelopes with orders only to open them in combat. In October 1942, aboard the USS Cleveland, the first live test was conducted against a drone aircraft off the coast of New Jersey. Gun crews loaded the shells, uncertain and skeptical. "Looks like any other round," one sailor said. "What's it supposed to do? Think for itself." The firing began. A shell streaked skyward and detonated within 50 feet of the target plane. The drone burst into flames. Another round fired, another explosion dead center. Cheers erupted across the deck. The gunners who had mocked the radio shells now begged for more. One officer wrote in his log that day, "The target was destroyed in 2 rounds. I would not have believed it possible." Word spread fast, but only through closed channels. Admiral William Blandy ordered the project classified above top secret. The fear of capture was immense. If a proximity fuse were recovered intact by the Japanese or Germans, it could unravel the Allies' entire advantage. So Tuve's team began embedding self-destruct features, small detonators that ensured if the shell missed its target and fell harmlessly, it would explode on impact or disintegrate beyond recovery. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Britain's own scientists were following the project closely. At the Admiralty Research Laboratory in Teddington, physicist Sir Samuel Curran and his team had been experimenting with similar radio fuses since 1939. Their early designs, known as the VT Mark III, relied on radar reflections to detonate. But British industry, strained under constant bombing, lacked the capacity for mass production. That's when the cooperation between Britain and the US deepened, through the TISAD mission. British technical secrets, including radar and jet research, were handed over to American labs. In return, the US provided scale, manpower, and manufacturing power. Tuve's lab, now flush with wartime funding, transformed prototypes into a full-scale production model. Contracts were awarded to companies like Raytheon, General Electric, RCA, and Crosley, each producing components under cover identities. Factory workers were told they were building radio altimeters or experimental timing devices. None were allowed to see the complete assembly. One Crosley engineer later recalled, "You'd be soldering a tube one day and packing it in a box marked fragile glass instruments. The next week, you'd hear rumors a Japanese bomber got blown out of the sky and you wondered, did I have a hand in that?" By late 1943, the production line was unstoppable. The Allies were churning out over 40,000 proximity fuses per day. But the project's secrecy had one ironic result. The Army initially resisted adopting it for field artillery. Commanders feared a dud might land in enemy hands. So, the fuse remained mostly at sea, where any malfunction would sink harmlessly into the ocean. That decision delayed its introduction on land until late 1944, just in time for one of the most desperate moments of the war, the Battle the Bulge. And when the first proximity-fused shells were fired over snow-covered forests of Belgium, they didn't just hit the enemy, they annihilated him. December 22nd, 1944, near Ardennes, Belgium. A fine, powdery snow dusted the trees like gunpowder. The road into the village was a churned ribbon of mud and broken glass. From a knoll overlooking the valley, Master Sergeant Earl Delaney watched with the hard, measured stare of a man who had counted too many good men go down. He had been on the beaches at Normandy and later in the hedgerows of Normandy. Now he commanded a battery of 150 Vapeurs howitzers that smelled of oil, brass, and cold. His men moved like clockwork in the wind. Fuse caps, powder bags, breech blocks, each motion practiced into muscle memory. They'd been given orders 3 days ago. Save the road. An armored column was reported moving through the woods that morning. If it reached Kell, it would split the American lodgment and expose supply lines. Delaney's orders were simple and brutal. Buy time. He had a crate of something in the back of the supply tent, a crate stamped with cryptic codes and instructions. Top secret, do not dissect. They had been told the rounds were to be used only in extremis. Tonight, extremis arrived. A spotter radioed. Enemy infantry and half-tracks, bearing 210, range 2,400 meters, request barrage. Delaney chewed his lip, thumbed the safety off a fuse cap, and barked the command. The loader slammed the shell into the breech. The gun thundered and the muzzle smoke hung in the air. For the first time on land, Delaney fired a proximity-fused 155. The shell climbed in a shining arc and vanished into the low cloud cover. Then, a blue flower of shrapnel and snow. The sky seemed to detonate itself a few hundred yards over the tree line. Men and horses and the canvas of a half-track were flung into ragged pieces. Those who watched knew something elemental had changed. The fuse made the shell an air scythe, sweeping down through enemy ranks with lethal, indiscriminate geometry. Afterward, soldiers who had been pinned down crawled from shell holes and stared at the horizon as if they had been given back the weather. Delaney logged the result in his journal, later censored and filed in a locked archive, and wrote one line: 1 box, 1 road saved. That ability to make a shell detonate above ground targets, not on impact, but in the air where shrapnel could spread like a storm, transformed field artillery into an anti-personnel instrument of terrifying efficiency. Where previously gunners had used timed fuses and crude grazing fire to cut down masses, proximity fuses allowed gunners to create lethal umbrellas above advancing troops, break up formations, and ruin the cohesion of mechanized convoys. The effect was as strategic as it was tactical. Fewer rounds, fewer exposures, fewer men wasted in endless barrages. But the decision to use the fuse on land had not been easy. Washington and London had fretted over the obvious risk. If a dud fuse fell intact behind enemy lines, its secrets, the tiny tubes, the reserve battery, the circuitry, could be harvested and studied. That single risk had kept the fuse at sea for the first 2 years of its life. Only after a string of successful naval trials, plus urgent lobbying from theater commanders and desperate requests from front-line units, did Allied High Command relent. The usage was limited, controlled, and written into strict authorization orders. Even so, there were moral and practical debates. Some officers argued that an air-bursting proximity shell over populated or contested terrain risked increased civilian casualties. Chaplains and medical officers raised the specter of a weapon that made killing both more certain and more efficient. And they asked whether such an instrument should be spread across fields and towns. In quiet mess halls, gunners argued that the fuse saved lives by blunting air attacks and shortening firefights. The answer, in the cold arithmetic of winter 1944, was simple for most. In many cases, it did both. It killed more of the enemy, and it preserved more of your own. The engineers who had labored in secrecy felt this tension acutely. Back at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Merle Tuve read reports from Ardennes test firings and felt pride threaded with a scientist's unease. He told his team, quietly, "We built a device to protect, but it is a tool. We must measure its use with care." Operationally, the Fuze forced doctrinal change. Artillery manuals were rewritten. Forward observers were trained to plan for aerial bursts. Gunners learned new ley lines and timing procedures. Logistics units adapted to ship and store sensitive fuses under strict temperature and handling rules. Ammunition supply trains changed their manifest codes. Ordnance officers learned to segregate VT rounds from conventional ones and to control access with keys and signed receipts. The result was immediate and measurable. In several engagements, the Allies reported a dramatic reduction in the number of shells required to halt enemy attacks. Attrition curves that once demanded thousands of rounds now required only a few hundred when proximity fuses were employed. Armored units could operate with less air cover. Convoys could move with reduced fighter escort. The fuse multiplied the effectiveness of existing weapons rather than replacing them, a classic force multiplier. And yet the technology's greatest victory was quieter, lives saved without spectacle. Pilots who would once have been easy pickings because of poor flak coverage now survived to fly another mission. Convoys bypassed harbors once considered too dangerous. Entire towns that might have suffered repeated bombing runs instead saw their attackers shredded before they reached bomb release points. Those small shifts, a plane that returned instead of crashing, a convoy that reached port on time, accumulated into a broader strategic advantage. By the end of the war, when the Fuze's secret was finally declassified and its manufacturers celebrated, the men in the foxholes and on the decks seldom recollected patent ceremonies. They remembered the feel of cold brass in hand, the thunder of the gun, and the moment when the sky itself seemed to answer. August 15th, 1945, Tokyo Bay. The sea was flat and silver beneath the gray morning haze. Battleships loomed at anchor, their guns silent for the first time in years. White flags fluttered on Japanese destroyers as American crews stood at parade rest along their decks. The war was ending. And in the quiet, an odd realization sank in among the men who had spent years feeding shells into cannons. They had seen the last great artillery war fought with unguided weapons. Below decks on the USS Missouri, in a storage room lined with brass casings, a petty officer named Charles Red Harmon took one last look at a crate marked VT Fuze's, handle carefully, Naval Ordnance Department. He ran his hand over the stenciled letters. "You know," he said to a younger sailor beside him, "these little bastards probably saved my life more times than I'll ever know." And he was right. By the end of World War II, the proximity fuse had destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other single defensive technology, second only to radar in overall strategic importance. The Allies had produced more than 22 million fuses, built in over 80 factories across the United States and Britain, assembled by hundreds of thousands of workers who never knew what they were really making. When the full story became public after VJ Day, it stunned the world. Newspapers dubbed it the second secret weapon, behind only the atomic bomb. President Harry Truman himself called it one of the most important new developments in the history of warfare. Yet unlike the atomic bomb, the proximity fuse carried no flash, no mushroom cloud, no singular moment of revelation. Its triumph was cumulative. Quiet victories multiplied 1,000-fold across every front. When declassified reports began circulating in 1946, they revealed the breathtaking scale of cooperation required to make the fuse a reality. Physicists from universities, corporate engineers, ordnance officers, and everyday factory workers had together solved a problem that blended science, industry, and pure audacity. Each fuse contained more than 130 separate parts, many handmade, all built to microscopic tolerances. Crossley Corporation produced the assembly shells. Raytheon and RCA crafted the miniature tubes. General Electric designed the batteries. The Army Ordnance Department oversaw logistics. Every piece was tested under live-fire conditions, and every test fed back into design improvements. The logistics alone rivaled any other wartime project. Trains carried components between secret factories. Armed guards watched over shipments. Even the paper trails were coded, invoices disguised, under civilian contracts so that not even the accountants knew what they were recording. In later interviews, several APL engineers recalled how they never expected the device to work at scale. One of them, Dr. James Van Allen, who would later become famous for discovering the Van Allen radiation belts, described the moment of success as watching technology outthink physics. The proximity fuse didn't end with 1945. It became the ancestor of modern smart weapons. Every missile with a radar guidance system, every anti-aircraft interceptor that senses its target's range before detonating, owes its lineage to Tuve's little glass tubes. During the Korean War, the same principle reappeared in improved artillery shells that devastated enemy infantry and defensive lines. In Vietnam, radar proximity fuses were adapted for airburst missions, detonating above jungle canopies to destroy hidden forces below. By the late Cold War, engineers had swapped vacuum tubes for solid-state circuits, making proximity sensors smaller, cheaper, and deadlier. The same idea, detecting reflection, triggering detonation at optimal distance, now guides everything from Patriot missiles to naval close-in defense guns. The core concept never changed. Know where your enemy is, and strike before contact. Yet, for all its brilliance, the Fuze's legacy wasn't just technological. It raised uncomfortable questions about automation and the distance between human intention and mechanical action. The proximity fuse made killing less dependent on the soldier's aim, and more on the circuit's logic. Philosophers and veterans alike debated what it meant when a shell could decide the moment of death. Was this the first step toward machines choosing when to kill? Or was it simply an extension of human ingenuity, a sharper tool in a brutal craft? In a 1946 lecture, Dr. Merle Tuve addressed a crowd at the American Physical Society. He didn't brag about victory. He spoke quietly, almost somberly. We have built a device that senses proximity, not for hatred, but for necessity. Every tube, every circuit, every spark was made to save the lives of men who would otherwise be lost. Let us hope that in the next war, we can turn such science to preserving peace instead of improving destruction. His words would echo decades later in the laboratories that built guided missiles and space probes. The same minds that had built weapons to kill were now building instruments to explore the cosmos. When historians list the great inventions of World War II, radar, jet engines, penicillin, the atomic bomb, the proximity fuse often hides near the bottom of the page. It has no dramatic photo, no iconic moment. It doesn't roar or glow. But its impact was immense. Before the fuse, anti-aircraft gunners fired blind curtains of steel, hoping to hit something. After it, they fired with purpose. Before the fuse, artillerymen watched shells bury themselves uselessly in mud. After it, they watched them burst in midair, sweeping fields clean. It changed the mathematics of war. A rare case where thinking smaller made the difference between victory and defeat. As one British officer put it after the war, it was a tiny brain in a steel skull, and it made the skies safer for every man on the ground. Years later, in 1955, Merle Tuve visited a naval museum in Washington where an early proximity fuse was displayed behind glass. He stood quietly before it, hands folded behind his back, his reflection mingling with that of the steel casing. A child standing nearby pointed at the small device and asked his father, What is it? The man replied. That little thing helped win the war. Tuve smiled faintly. That little thing, he murmured, helped keep the world from burning just a bit longer.